Okay, I am James Whitaker, and this is going to be MTSS, multi-tiered system of support, and how it's used, what it is and how it's used. Forgive me if you hear my dog being a little bit silly here. So basic introduction here is that MTSS is a system of support that is intended to integrate all students. So you're going to have your gen ed students, you're going to have students with special needs, and then there is even a component, or there should be a component, to help with advanced students as well. Everything that is being done here is going to be high quality research-based instruction, and then intervention adjustments are going to be based on student success, but I'm going to expound on all of this here momentarily. So real quick, I've got what I think are the 6 essential steps to doing MTSS correctly. The first is that you're going to screen all students. The second is going to be a skills analysis or some sort of more in-depth diagnostic analysis for students that are identified as maybe having some sort of special need. Then you're going to have your intervention third, and the intervention is going to be the additional support based on what we got from the screening and the assessments. During the intervention, as the intervention goes along, there's going to be progress monitoring, and then the final step of the intervention is going to be evaluation. I'm adding a 6th step that is not necessarily the last step, and that is going to be parent communication, but we'll talk more about that later. This is the process here. You've got your universal screening of all students. Heinz, that noise is going to sound terrible on here, okay? Once you've done that, then you're going to go into your skills analysis or diagnostics in order to pinpoint the specific area of need, followed by, that'll lead us then to the intervention. The progress monitoring to track the intervention will happen periodically, and then at the end, or at some predetermined point, we're going to have an evaluation. Hey, I am working. I'm supposed to get a grade on this. Back up. So we'll talk a little bit more in depth about each step. First is the screening. This is going to be some sort of assessment that measures the expected skills and behaviors of all students. And then we're going to use that data to identify students that are at risk of having some sort of trouble. Now, the screening can happen once per year, but it may be necessary to do it multiple times per year. Step 2 then is going to be our skills analysis or diagnostic assessment. This is going to be the in-depth assessment that we're going to use to pinpoint the very specific needs that each student has. We're going to analyze the data, and then that data is going to be hopefully presented at a meeting that involves the classroom teacher, the parents, support staff, possibly other staff members or administrators. And in this meeting, we're going to determine the correct type of intervention that should happen. So it's important that parents get a say in this, or at least are made aware of what's going on. Generally, I would assume that the classroom teacher or special ed teacher is going to be the one making the recommendations. And then here's where we're going to talk about the progress monitoring and assessment decisions. So as these things happen then, we decide on an intervention. We decide the specific days and times that the intervention is going to happen. And this is where you're going to get additional support for the students that we've identified. If we're talking in terms of tiers, we're going to look now at tier 2, where we're going to have a targeted intervention for small groups of students. This could give us, it's going to give us additional time to work on these specific skills. It's going to give the students a chance to practice more. And then you just got that additional guidance here in this, whatever specific need the students have. Throughout the intervention, we're going to monitor their progress. So these are going to be some sort of assessment that are going to measure their skills and determine whether or not there's growth. So the frequency may vary, but this progress monitoring could happen as often as every week, depending on what was determined previously. The data from these assessments are going to be analyzed and documented, and then this data is going to provide, it's going to help assist in future decisions regarding the intervention and evaluation. Step 5 is going to be the evaluation, and this is like the overall assessment of, is the intervention doing what we want it to do? And then we've got options based on the results of this assessment. My dog is pulling on my sleeves. If it's working, if we feel like we are making progress, but we're not necessarily where we want the student to be, then the decision might just be to continue the intervention. If the student's not where we want to be, or we think maybe we're not getting the growth that we're hoping for, then maybe we're going to make adjustments to the intervention. But if the intervention is working really well and students are getting to where we want them, then this may be what we use to decide to start to remove them or wean them off the intervention. And then we've got the parent communication aspect. Now, this is not necessarily the final step, although it's listed as the final step. This should happen regularly throughout the process. Obviously, it's going to happen early on when we first identify them. The parents should be involved in the meetings and the decisions that are being made, but then throughout the intervention process, phone calls should be happening. Emails are super easy. We should be able to provide access to assessment scores, even if it's just something simple like a quick text to mom and dad, hey, Billy scored 18 out of 20 on his progress monitoring today, or whatever. Just ways to constantly keep them updated. They should be invited to any meetings that take place regarding their student and these intervention decisions. And then parents need to be made aware that they have a right to request an evaluation for special services, because a lot of them don't know that they have that right to request a meeting. Parents often just sort of think that the schools just decide and tell us that. So these are all ways that parents should be involved in this process. Overall, this is what it's going to look like. We're going to do our screening, and we're going to have the 3 tiers of this particular system. So tier 1 is going to be the universal instruction, the stuff that happens every day in the classroom, like normal. And hopefully, in a typical school, this is going to be sufficient for 80 to 90% of our students. When we move into tier 2, we've got our targeted interventions that are done in a group. And typically, hopefully, this should be 5 to 15% of our students. But then you may occasionally have a tier 3 person, which is someone who really requires intensive, individualized interventions. And that hopefully is going to be 1 to 5% of the student population. And we can also go back and look at these a little bit differently, though. Rather than looking at them in terms of students that have special needs, these could also be students that are advanced. And maybe they're in tier 2 because a group of them in math or whatever, in math or whatever are a little bit advanced. And so we're going to meet with them and teach them some new things or help push them. Tier 3 might be a really gifted student who's just kind of way beyond his or her peers. And hey, we're going to have some special time with this student to really push and really work. So as we work through this intervention process, what data are we using? Initially, we're going to look at state assessments or data from the previous school year. We're going to look at that screening data. Here in Kansas, we're going to look at the Mtss testing results. We're going to use the progress monitoring data or benchmark assessments. We're going to be looking at classroom performance. We're going to look at their report card, but there are other possibilities too, particularly with MTSS. There are going to be some other data points that we're going to look at. Specifically, that's going to be attendance data, behavior and discipline data, their work habits in the classroom, and then possibly even medical data. And there's a reason this data is a little bit different. That is because one often overlooked fact is that MTSS and RTI, a response to intervention, are not the same thing. They are very similar. Both of them address academic needs, and they have a multi-tier system to address those needs. But with MTSS, there is a social or emotional component, or basically a non-academic component that RTI doesn't have. And that's why when we are working through these interventions and trying to figure out exactly what students need, that's why we're looking at attendance data, behavior and discipline data, work habits, and then possibly even medical data, if available. So just real quick, there were a bunch of studies that all sort of showed similar results with the use of MTSS, but Leonard and his colleagues in 2019 did a study. And what they found was that with 1 year of support, students that were part of intervention groups showed 8% more growth than students who had similar needs but didn't have this multi-tiered system of support. Over 2 years, those same students showed 19% more growth than students who didn't have the support. And then school-wide, what they did with this study was they looked at specifically 4 different school systems in Connecticut and compared those school systems to school systems that didn't have MTSS. And what they found basically overall is that all schools showed more growth in 1 year than schools who didn't use it. And all showed more growth in 2 years than schools who didn't use it. So there were other studies that showed similar things, but this one laid it out pretty simply. The conclusion here is that this type of support system is useful and appropriate. I recommend, personally, I would recommend this type of system over just RTI because of its non-academic component. We've talked about ways that we're helping the whole student. And I think MTSS has that built in, whereas RTI is missing a little bit. This type of system is useful for students that are lacking skills, and it's also useful for students that are advanced. It can be used with both groups sufficiently. Overall, those are the references that were used. Thank you very much. If I can stop this.